What happens when you trade a steady husband for a thrill seeker, only to watch your ex-husband rise to wealth while you collapse? I thought excitement would save me, but instead it destroyed everything. My name is Corinna Vale. I am 31 years old, and I once convinced myself that excitement mattered more than stability, that thrills could replace devotion, that danger meant freedom. Ethan Vale, my husband of nearly a decade, was 34, steady, hardworking, reliable, and I dismissed him as boring. I told myself his patience was weakness, that his calmness meant failure, that his loyalty made him predictable, and I craved something louder. That craving pulled me toward Jace Morales, a street racer with tattoos, adrenaline, and a reckless smile that made me feel alive. I told myself I deserved it, that one taste of danger was worth abandoning a man I called dull, but I never expected consequences to arrive so quickly. My friend Kendra told me I was bold, that Ethan would always forgive me, while Margaret, his mother, narrowed her eyes and warned me that loyalty was not boring. It was priceless. I laughed at her words, waved away her concern, and convinced myself I was untouchable, but the truth was already tightening around me. Now Ethan is wealthy, respected, and admired, while I am the one begging, watching his new life from the outside. The first cracks in my marriage began quietly, not with shouting or betrayal, but with the kind of silence that grows between two people when one begins believing they deserve more. Ethan would come home each evening, his tie loosened, his posture tired but steady, and he would sit at the kitchen table, balancing bills while I scrolled on my phone, restless and detached. I told myself his steadiness was boring, that his routine meant failure, that his predictability smothered me. Though deep down, I knew his loyalty was what most women prayed for. Still, I convinced myself boredom was worse than betrayal, that loyalty meant nothing if it did not thrill me, that comfort was the same as stagnation. I began dressing differently, staying out longer, meeting friends more often, telling Ethan I needed space, telling myself I was finding freedom. He never argued, never raised his voice, never accused me. He only nodded calmly, his eyes heavy but quiet, and that silence irritated me more than anger would have. I wanted him to chase me, to question me, to demand my attention, but he refused to play that part, and I called it weakness. Kendra fed my discontent, sitting across bar tables with her martinis, nodding eagerly as I told her Ethan had grown dull, that I felt trapped, that I wanted something more. She told me I was young, that I deserved excitement, that I should not waste my years on a man who only cared about clocking hours and paying bills. Her words felt liberating, like permission, like validation, and I clung to them because they echoed the voice already growing inside me. Around this time, I met Jace Morales through a co-worker's friend, a man who lived entirely differently than Ethan, reckless, wild, always surrounded by noise and danger. He drove sleek cars, spoke loudly, carried himself with arrogance that looked like confidence, and I felt drawn to him like a moth to a flame. He called himself a street racer, and though I knew deep down it meant instability, I told myself it meant adventure. The first night I rode with him, the city lights blurring past as engines roared, my heart pounded in a way Ethan's steady love never had, and I mistook adrenaline for fulfillment. I told myself this was living, that Ethan's quiet evenings folding laundry were death, that a loyal man was nothing compared to a thrilling one. Jace laughed recklessly, his hand brushing mine as we tore down the highway, and I felt more alive in those minutes than I admitted I had felt in years. I returned home late that night, smelling of gasoline and smoke, and Ethan looked up from his papers, his eyes steady, his lips pressed together, his silence heavy. I snapped at him for staring, accused him of judging me, told him he was paranoid, but he said nothing, only returned to his folder of documents, sorting carefully, calmly, methodically. That folder became a symbol I ignored, the weight of papers I pretended were work, but deep down I sensed they were more. I began visiting the racing garages with Jace, watching men crowd around cars, shouting bets, exchanging cash, and though I knew it was dangerous, I told myself I belonged there. They looked at me differently than Ethan ever did, their eyes filled with thrill rather than steadiness, their words filled with risk rather than responsibility, and I convinced myself that attention was love. Kendra cheered me on, telling me I glowed, that I looked younger, freer, alive. But Margaret noticed the change immediately. She pulled me aside during one family visit, her eyes sharp, her tone cold, telling me Ethan deserved loyalty, telling me I was making a mistake, telling me thrill would fade. I laughed at her, waved her off, accused her of being bitter and jealous, but her words lingered in the back of my mind. Ethan's father, Daniel, remained quieter, but his disappointed eyes cut deeper than Margaret's sharpness, and I hated how exposed I felt under their gaze. The tension at home thickened. Ethan remained calm, but I grew louder, mocking his quietness, mocking his predictability, mocking his lack of adventure, and convincing myself I was justified. I told friends he never excited me, that he only cared about bills and chores, that he was too weak to keep a woman like me. The more I said it, the more I believed it, until I began seeing him not as a husband but as an anchor holding me down. I mocked him in front of others, laughed about his boring nature, dismissed his loyalty as mediocrity, and though he never retaliated, I could feel the silence between us growing like a canyon. One night I returned late again, smelling faintly of gasoline, and I caught sight of Ethan at the desk, carefully slipping receipts into a folder, his expression calm but final. My stomach tightened, but I brushed it off, telling myself he would never act, that loyal men never left, that silence always meant surrender. Looking back, that was arrogance disguised as confidence, blindness disguised as bravery, selfishness disguised as freedom, and I should have recognized it. Ethan's silence was not weakness, it was preparation, his folder not distraction but evidence, his calmness not surrender but strategy. I told myself I was winning, that I was finally free, that Jace's world was worth more than Ethan's patience. But the truth was already forming around me like chains I could not see. My loyalty had been traded for adrenaline, my stability traded for recklessness, my respect traded for noise, and I called it liberation. I believed Ethan's patience meant he would always wait, that his silence meant I still had control, that his loyalty meant I could betray him without consequence. But the truth was far different, and his silence was only the beginning of my downfall. The family dinner was supposed to be ordinary, just another Sunday evening at Margaret and Daniel's home, with roast beef, potatoes, and polite conversation filling the air. But I arrived determined to prove myself right. I had spent weeks convincing myself Ethan was boring, that his loyalty meant nothing, that his silence was weakness, and I wanted an audience to witness my performance. Kendra encouraged me beforehand, telling me I should speak my truth, that women deserved excitement, that I had every right to reject predictability, and her words fueled my arrogance. Ethan carried a dessert quietly, his shoulders squared, his face calm, his silence pressing heavier than any argument, and I hated how composed he seemed. Margaret greeted us at the door with warmth for her son, but her eyes narrowed when they turned to me, and I felt judgment already surrounding me. Daniel shook Ethan's hand firmly, his quiet respect obvious, and then we all sat around the long wooden table, plates steaming, the room filled with tension beneath the smell of food. I began loudly, telling stories about adventure, about excitement, about living boldly, painting Ethan as the man who never understood me, never thrilled me, never matched my energy. I said it playfully, with a laugh, with exaggerated gestures, as though mocking him was harmless, as though humiliating him was entertainment, and I expected people to laugh with me. Kendra chuckled nervously, her glass clinking as she lifted it, but the rest of the table remained quiet. Their forks paused, their eyes darting between us. Ethan stayed calm, eating quietly, folding his napkin neatly, drinking water slowly, and the more silent he stayed, the louder I became. I called him predictable, said he cared more about bills than passion, said I deserved more than grocery lists and laundry, and I watched Margaret's eyes narrow further. She finally set her fork down firmly, her voice sharp as she asked if tearing her son down in front of his family made me feel powerful. Her words stung, but I forced a laugh, waving her off, accusing her of being old-fashioned, insisting she did not understand modern marriage, insisting she had no right to interfere. I looked to Kendra for support, and she nodded quickly, calling me brave, calling me bold, but her voice sounded thinner than usual, as if even she doubted what she was saying. Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, deliberate, saying Ethan had always been loyal, always been hardworking, always been the kind of man who carried weight others could not. His words cut deeper than Margaret's sharpness, because they carried disappointment rather than anger, truth rather than accusation, and for a moment I faltered. I recovered quickly, raising my glass, laughing louder, claiming loyalty without passion was worthless, claiming stability without excitement was a prison, claiming I was choosing freedom instead of suffocation. But the room stayed cold, the silence heavy, the disapproval undeniable, and I felt heat rising in my chest despite my forced smile. Ethan finally stood, his movements calm, deliberate, unhurried, folding his napkin neatly and placing it beside his plate before excusing himself. He did not argue, did not defend himself, did not respond to my humiliation. He only walked from the room silently, his posture straight, his presence commanding even in retreat. That silence humiliated me more than if he had shouted, because it left me exposed, left me without an enemy to push against, left me looking cruel while he appeared dignified. Margaret shook her head slowly, her voice cold, saying Ethan deserved better than disrespect, saying loyalty was not boring, saying I had no idea what I was throwing away. I snapped back that she had always hated me, that she had poisoned him against me, that she was clinging to tradition, but her eyes only grew colder. Daniel remained quiet, but his steady gaze spoke louder than words, and I felt myself shrinking under it despite my desperate laughter. Kendra tried to ease the tension, lifting her glass, forcing a smile, saying maybe people just wanted different things, but the effort fell flat. The room stayed tense, conversations died, forks moved quietly, and everyone avoided my eyes as if I were contagious. I sipped my wine, laughed louder, tried to fill the silence, but every attempt made me look more desperate, more unstable, more cruel. By the time dessert was served, no one spoke to me directly, not even Kendra, whose eyes flickered nervously every time I raised my voice. The dinner I thought I could use as a stage had turned into a courtroom, and I was the only one on trial. Ethan's silence had made me look guilty. Margaret's sharpness had exposed my arrogance. Daniel's disappointment had revealed my selfishness, and I had lost control completely. Back home, the silence continued. Ethan moved through the house calmly, collecting dishes, feeding the dog, folding his clothes, while I stormed through rooms demanding he speak, demanding he fight, demanding he react. He said nothing, offered nothing, only carried himself with quiet composure, and his refusal to engage drove me insane. I told myself his calmness proved weakness, that his retreat meant I had won, that silence meant surrender. But deep down, I felt a tremor of something else. His silence was no longer patience, it was certainty, and I began to sense he had already decided something I could not undo. That night, I saw him again with the folder, sorting papers, sliding receipts inside, and I knew then it was not work, it was evidence. My chest tightened, but I convinced myself he would never act, that loyal men always forgave, that his silence was only a bluff. Looking back, that dinner was the moment I lost the family completely. The moment Margaret stopped pretending civility. The moment Daniel withdrew his respect. The moment Ethan walked away without words. I thought I was clever, thought I was strong, thought I was untouchable, but my arrogance turned me into the villain before their eyes. I believed mocking loyalty made me powerful, but it only revealed my cruelty. And I believed silence meant weakness, but it only proved Ethan's strength. That night should have been my warning, but I ignored it, laughed it off, told myself I was still winning. In truth, the walls were already closing in, and Ethan's silence was already the sound of my marriage ending. After the disaster at that family dinner, I threw myself fully into Jace's world, because it was easier to cling to noise than face the suffocating silence Ethan left behind. The racing garages smelled of oil, smoke, and adrenaline, filled with shouting men, revving engines, and the thrill I kept mistaking for love. I stood there in ripped jeans and heavy makeup, pretending I belonged, pretending I was alive, pretending the danger around me meant freedom. Jace thrived in that chaos, grinning recklessly, betting cash on himself, revving his car until the crowd cheered, and I convinced myself his recklessness was passion. He treated me like a trophy at first, pulling me close in public, showing me off like proof of his status, and I mistook that arrogance for devotion. I told myself Ethan had never looked at me that way, never made me feel electric, never given me nights filled with danger, and I called that lack of danger weakness. But behind the adrenaline, cracks appeared quickly. Jace disappeared for days sometimes, showing up only when it suited him, brushing off my questions, telling me I was too clingy, too serious, too demanding. His phone buzzed with messages he never explained, his laughter too casual when I asked, his attention already drifting to other women leaning against cars. I swallowed my humiliation, telling myself this was freedom, telling myself excitement meant chaos, telling myself I had chosen passion over boredom. Kendra came with me once, wide-eyed at the noise and the danger, but even she admitted later she worried. She said Jace was reckless, said his lifestyle could swallow me whole, said Ethan's silence looked safer now, but I snapped back at her. I told her she was jealous, told her she didn't understand, told her loyalty meant nothing compared to thrill, though her words haunted me afterward. Meanwhile, Ethan grew even quieter at home. He stopped asking where I was, stopped questioning my late nights, stopped reacting at all, and his absence of anger terrified me more than shouting ever could. He carried that folder everywhere now, slipping it into his briefcase, setting it on the counter, tucking it into locked drawers, and I knew it held pieces of my betrayal. I told myself he would never use it, that loyal men always forgave, that silence was just surrender, but deep down, I felt the tremor of something final. He looked at me differently, not with love or pain, but with detachment, as though I was already gone, as though he had already moved on. That detachment cut deeper than Jace's dismissiveness, because it meant Ethan had stopped fighting entirely, and I was too blind to see the strength in that. One evening, after leaving the garage, I spotted Ethan downtown, his posture calm, his suit pressed, his briefcase in hand as he entered a sleek office building. My stomach sank immediately, because I knew it was not work, it was preparation, it was planning, it was the consequence of every late night I had excused. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching him disappear through glass doors, realizing his silence had never been weakness. It had been strategy. When I confronted him later, demanding to know where he had been, accusing him of sneaking behind my back, he only looked at me with steady eyes. He did not argue, did not defend, did not accuse, only silence that spoke louder than anything I could twist. That silence terrified me, because it confirmed he was already building a life without me. Jace grew colder as weeks passed, answering calls less, dismissing me more, treating me like background noise when other women were around. His laughter with them stung more than I admitted, but I clung to him anyway, because losing him would mean I had abandoned stability for nothing. I told myself he cared, told myself he was just busy, told myself freedom was messy, but every glance at his phone proved otherwise. Kendra stopped coming around, her texts shorter, her visits fewer, her voice sharper when she finally told me she couldn't keep watching me unravel. I accused her of betrayal, reminded her she once called me brave, reminded her she pushed me toward excitement, but she only sighed and walked away, losing her cut deep because even my strongest supporter had grown tired of my excuses. Margaret refused to answer my calls now, her sharpness complete, her judgment final, her loyalty firmly tied to Ethan, and I hated her for it. Daniel did not speak either, but his silence carried weight, his disapproval obvious whenever our paths crossed, his disappointment more crushing than Margaret's fury. I told myself they were blind, clinging to tradition, too rigid to see the truth, but the truth was I had lost them entirely. I had traded their respect for Jace's reckless smile, and now even Jace treated me like an afterthought. Looking back, this was the stage where my arrogance transformed into desperation, though I hid it beneath louder laughter, heavier makeup, and wilder stories. I told everyone I was free, that I was alive, that Ethan was boring, that loyalty was nothing, but deep inside I felt hollow. Ethan's silence grew louder each day, the folder heavier, the briefcase sharper, the locked drawers more final, and I knew something irreversible was approaching. Jace's world no longer thrilled me. It drained me, left me humiliated, left me begging for scraps of attention, but I convinced myself I could still win. I believed Ethan would never leave, that Jace would eventually commit, that I was still untouchable, but everything around me was already crumbling. Ethan's silence had become my undoing, Jace's carelessness my humiliation, Kendra's distance my loneliness, Margaret's judgment my condemnation. And still I laughed louder, blind to the ruin pressing closer. By the time gossip spread beyond the garages and into my own circles, I realized my story was no longer mine to control, and I scrambled desperately to reclaim the narrative. At gatherings with friends or co-workers, I laughed louder than anyone, insisting I was misunderstood, insisting Ethan was boring, insisting Jace represented passion, while my husband represented nothing. I painted myself as brave, as bold, as liberated, telling anyone who listened that I had chosen excitement over suffocation, that loyalty meant nothing without thrill, that tradition was dead. At first, a few people nodded politely, offering thin smiles, but their eyes told the truth, heavy with pity, sharp with judgment, silent with disbelief. The more I insisted on my version, the more obvious it became that nobody believed me, that I sounded desperate, that I looked unstable, and I hated how quickly I was losing control. I wore brighter clothes, heavier makeup, bolder smiles, trying to convince myself I was still radiant, but even in the mirror, I could see the cracks forming. Jace's presence did not save me either, because he was never consistent, never reliable, never steady, and his attention grew weaker each week. He arrived late, disappeared suddenly, laughed with other women more openly, and when I asked about them, he brushed me off coldly, calling me dramatic, calling me clingy, calling me boring. His dismissals felt like knives, but I swallowed them, telling myself excitement was messy, telling myself thrill came with pain, telling myself passion was never safe. I convinced myself Ethan would never compare, that loyalty was dull, that I had chosen correctly, but deep inside, I felt emptier than I admitted. Kendra had already withdrawn, her visits rare, her tone sharp, her patience gone, and when I tried to vent to her, she cut me short, saying she could not stand watching me unravel anymore. I called her a hypocrite, accused her of abandoning me, accused her of cowardice, but she did not return, and I knew I had lost her too. At home, the silence was unbearable, thicker than ever, heavier than before, because Ethan's presence was fading day by day. He no longer waited for me in the evenings, no longer asked where I had been, no longer engaged at all, and the absence of his attention hurt more than his anger would have. He spent evenings in the study, door closed, lights glowing late, the sound of typing and printers filling the air, and I knew he was building something against me. I barged into the study once, demanding answers, demanding explanations, accusing him of hiding, but he only looked at me with steady eyes, calm and final, before turning back to his work. That calmness enraged me, because it meant I had no leverage, no control, no audience, and my words only echoed against his silence uselessly. Then one evening, I came home to find drawers empty, closets cleared, shelves stripped of his belongings, and my chest tightened with the realization that he had finally moved out. Half the house felt hollow, every room echoing with loss, every space reminding me of what I had taken for granted. He left without telling me, without arguing, without explaining, just silence and absence, and that absence cut deeper than any confrontation. I raged that night, storming through empty rooms, pouring drinks, shouting into the silence, telling myself he was cruel, telling myself he was punishing me, telling myself he would regret leaving. But the truth gnawed at me with every echo, because I knew he had not left impulsively. He had prepared carefully, methodically, patiently, while I wasted myself chasing thrills. His silence had not been weakness at all, it had been power, and he had wielded it perfectly until the house itself testified against me. Neighbors began whispering too, their glances sharper when they saw me outside, their conversations dying when I passed, their pity heavier than any insult. Margaret refused all my calls, her disapproval total, her judgment final, her loyalty devoted only to Ethan now. And Daniel did not speak to me either. His silence was worse than anger, because it carried disappointment, carried shame, carried quiet condemnation that spoke volumes. I realized I was cut off completely, not just from Ethan, but from the family that once welcomed me, from the network I had mocked and dismissed. I told myself I didn't care, that I was free, that Jace and I would build something different, but Jace barely answered my calls anymore. Barely noticed when I arrived at the garages, barely cared when I stood beside him. Looking back, this was the stage where my arrogance collapsed completely, replaced by desperation I refused to name. I still laughed loudly in public, still painted myself as misunderstood, still told people I had chosen passion, but everyone saw the truth beneath my performance. They saw Ethan's dignity growing, his silence commanding, his absence powerful, while I shrank into noise and chaos. They saw Jace treating me like nothing, Kendra abandoning me, Margaret and Daniel erasing me, neighbors pitying me, and they recognized what I denied. I had left a loyal man for recklessness, and the loyal man was already winning without lifting his voice. I believed his silence meant weakness, but it had always meant strength. And now the emptiness of the house, the whispers in the neighborhood, the fading attention of Jace all proved it. That half-empty house should have been my wake-up call, the moment I stopped pretending, the moment I faced truth, but I refused to. I poured another drink, put on another bright dress, told myself the world was blind, told myself I was still ahead, told myself Ethan would never truly leave. But deep inside, I already knew he had, and I already knew I had lost more than I could ever regain. The envelope came one grey morning, thick and heavy, sliding across the floor like a verdict, and I knew instantly what waited inside. My hands shook as I ripped it open, scanning the pages filled with neat type, signatures, dates, and cold arrangements that spelled the end of my marriage. Ethan had filed for divorce, and attached to the documents were copies of receipts, phone records, and carefully collected evidence I had been too arrogant to hide. There were screenshots of late-night transactions, gas station purchases at impossible hours, notes of my absences, even photos of me at the garages when I thought no one was watching. Every detail was organized, precise, undeniable, leaving me no room to twist, no room to excuse, no room to pretend. His silence had not been surrender, it had been calculation, and he had built his case with patience while I wasted my energy performing bravado. When we met at the lawyer's office, I tried to hold on to control, telling myself I could still win him back, that my charm would soften him, that my tears would sway him. I told him I had only sought honesty, that I had only craved freedom, that I had only wanted more than routine, but his expression did not change. He sat with calm composure, his hands steady, his voice minimal, his presence dignified, and nothing I said moved him. The lawyer explained the division of assets, the separation terms, the arrangements, and every word felt like a blade cutting deeper. I begged openly, my voice shaking, my hands trembling, insisting I had never stopped caring, insisting I had only been confused, insisting I had only wanted to feel alive. But Ethan's silence remained unbroken, his gaze firm, his decision final, and I realized begging had no power against him anymore. Margaret and Daniel attended one session, their presence like a wall behind him, their loyalty fierce, their disapproval sharp, and their judgment unbearable. Margaret's voice carried no sympathy as she said Ethan deserved better, said loyalty was not boring, said I had mistaken weakness for strength. Her eyes burned into me with certainty, with vindication, with the satisfaction of being proven right, and I hated her more than ever for it. Daniel spoke little, but his nods were steady, his approval for Ethan clear, his disappointment in me carved into every glance. I wanted to scream at them, to remind them of the years I had been their daughter-in-law, the years I had shared meals at that table, but the memories no longer mattered. I was erased from them already, erased from Ethan's family, erased from the life I once claimed as mine. Kendra did not attend, and by then she had stopped answering my calls entirely. Her silence was different from Ethan's. Hers was abandonment, exhaustion, pity that turned into distance, and it left me lonelier than I admitted. The co-workers who once whispered behind my back now avoided me entirely, their pity turning into contempt, their conversations dying when I entered the room. I became a shadow in every circle I once held, the woman who threw away loyalty for chaos, the woman who mocked stability and ended up with nothing. And as I sat across from Ethan in that cold office, I realized everyone saw him as the stronger one, the wiser one, the one who had survived me. The lawyer slid the papers across the table, asking Ethan to sign, and he lifted the pen with calm certainty, his hand steady, his signature bold, and my heart sank with each stroke. I wanted to shout, to claw the pen away, to tear the papers apart, but my body stayed frozen, my mouth too dry, my pride too broken. He pushed the documents back without even glancing at me, stood up with dignity, adjusted his jacket, and walked out the door. He did not slam it, did not linger, did not look back, and that finality crushed me more than any argument could have. His silence was not absence anymore. It was freedom, his freedom, carved out of my chaos, earned through patience, sealed with dignity. Margaret approached me once, her words sharp, her eyes unforgiving, telling me I had no one to blame but myself. She reminded me Ethan had always been loyal, steady, and worthy, while I had traded him for a man who could not even stay sober or faithful. Her words cut deep, and I had no reply, only silence that matched the emptiness Jace left behind. Daniel offered me nothing either, only a small nod before turning away, and that quiet dismissal hurt worse than shouting because it proved I was already erased. The lawyer's office became the stage of my final humiliation, the place where every excuse collapsed and Ethan's silence proved stronger than all my noise. I thought I was bold and modern, but I was selfish and blind. I thought his patience meant weakness, but it was strength, and he ended our life together without ever raising his voice. The papers in my trembling hands were not just legal. They were the story of my downfall, sealed forever by his calm certainty. Weeks later, I saw him at a charity gala, sharper, taller, more confident than I remembered. Through glass doors, I watched him command the room, his tailored suit shining, his smile dignified, his presence magnetic. People leaned toward him, eager for his words, while I lingered outside like a ghost, aching with regret. I once mocked him for being boring and predictable, yet now he was admired, respected and wealthy, while I was reduced to watching from the shadows. Ethan had built his own logistics firm, pouring silence into success, and it flourished. His parents bragged proudly, neighbors praised his name, and friends who once laughed at my arrogance now turned away. Every whisper about his growth twisted deeper into my stomach. Every mention of Jace's disappearance reminded me how foolish I had been. Jace left me with debt and humiliation, while Ethan rose higher than ever. Even Irene, his aunt, told me plainly I was no longer family, no longer welcome, no longer relevant. The final blow came when I saw his new home. Warm lights glowing, laughter spilling from windows. He stepped outside briefly, his eyes finding me across the street. No anger, no words, just a small shake of his head before he turned back inside. That door closed gently but completely, sealing the truth I had refused to face. His silence was stronger than my noise, his loyalty, the treasure I threw away, and now I am nothing but a cautionary story begging for what I can never have again. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.